James Carter let out a heavy sigh, his breath forming a small cloud in the frigid air of his unmarked sedan. The Chicago winter had sunk its teeth deep into the city, and even the car's struggling heater couldn't keep the chill at bay. He glanced at his watch, 3:47 p.m. They'd been sitting here for nearly 6 hours, and the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the frost-covered streets. Next to him, Michael Harris took another sip from his thermos, grimacing at the now-cold coffee. "You know," Michael said, breaking the silence that had settled between them, "I'm starting to think this might be a bust." James nodded, his eyes never leaving the dilapidated warehouse across the street. The building was a relic of Chicago's industrial past, its brick walls crumbling and windows boarded up. But according to their intel, it was far from abandoned. "Maybe," he admitted, "but we've got to be sure. Too much riding on this one." The two FBI agents had been partners for the better part of 5 years, long enough to develop the kind of shorthand that made long stakeouts like this bearable. James was the younger of the two, in his early 30s with a shock of dark hair that never seemed to stay in place. Michael, pushing 50, wore his experience in the lines around his eyes and the salt and pepper of his closely cropped hair. "You hear from Sarah lately?" Michael asked, trying to keep the conversation going to ward off the monotony. James shook his head. "Not since last week. She's busy with finals." There was a touch of pride in his voice as he spoke about his daughter, a freshman at Northwestern. "First semester of college, you know how it is." Michael chuckled. "Oh, I remember. Seems like yesterday Lily was stressing over her first round of college exams. Now she's talking about grad school." He paused, a fond smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "They grow up fast, don't they?" "Too fast," James agreed, allowing himself a moment of distraction. But his eyes quickly snapped back to the warehouse. "Hold up. You see that?" Michael leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. A figure had emerged from a side door of the warehouse, hunched against the cold. Even from this distance, they could see the telltale bulge of a concealed weapon under the man's heavy coat. "That's gotta be one of Dmitri's guys," James muttered, referring to Dmitri Volkov, the suspected ringleader of the human trafficking operation they'd been investigating for months. Michael nodded, already reaching for the radio to call it in. But before he could, the man disappeared back inside the warehouse. "Damn it," James hissed. "We need to get eyes inside that building." "Patience, Carter," Michael cautioned. "We rush this, we could blow the whole operation. Remember what happened in Detroit?" James winced at the memory. A similar case, a similar stakeout. But they'd moved too soon, and the traffickers had scattered, taking their victims with them. It had taken months to pick up the trail again, and James still carried the weight of those lost months, and the lives that might have been saved in that time. "Yeah, I remember," he said quietly. "But how long do we wait? Every day we sit here is another day those people are suffering." Michael didn't have an answer for that. It was the question that haunted every case like this, the delicate balance between gathering enough evidence to make the charges stick and moving quickly enough to save lives. As the silence settled over them again, James found his mind wandering to how he'd ended up here. He'd joined the bureau right out of college, driven by a desire to make a difference. But it was during his second year, when he'd worked his first human trafficking case, that he'd found his true calling. The faces of the victims he'd helped rescue, some of them just kids, had stayed with him. Since then, he'd dedicated his career to fighting this particular brand of evil. A gust of wind rattled the car, sending a shiver down James's spine. He reached for his own thermos, hoping for a last swallow of warmth, but found it empty. "Think the corner store's still open?" he asked Michael. "I could use a refill." Michael checked his watch. "Should be. Want me to make a run?" James shook his head. "Nah, I need to stretch my legs anyway." "You good to hold down the fort?" "Been doing it for 20 years, Michael replied with a wry smile. "Think I can manage another 10 minutes. James stepped out of the car, immediately hunching his shoulders against the biting wind. The street was eerily quiet, most sensible people having sought shelter from the cold. He made his way down the block, his footsteps crunching in the thin layer of snow that had begun to accumulate. The corner store was a welcome oasis of warmth and light. The elderly owner, Mr. Patel, greeted James with a nod. They'd gotten to know each other over the course of this stakeout, though Mr. Patel thought James was just another office worker putting in long hours. The usual? Mr. Patel asked as James approached the counter. Please, James replied, fishing out his wallet. And throw in a couple of those sandwiches too, will you? The turkey ones. As Mr. Patel busied himself with the coffee machine, James's eyes drifted to the TV mounted in the corner. A local news report was playing, showing footage of a protest outside City Hall. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Community demands action on missing persons cases." James felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He knew that some of those missing persons were likely victims of the very trafficking ring he and Michael were trying to bring down. But he couldn't tell the protesters that. Couldn't give them the hope, or the confirmation of their worst fears, that might jeopardize the investigation. Terrible business, that, Mr. Patel said, following James's gaze to the TV. My niece, she knew one of the girls who went missing. Sweet kid, just turned 18. Families beside themselves. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He paid for the coffee and sandwiches, giving Mr. Patel a few extra dollars. Stay warm out there, the old man called as James pushed open the door, the bell jingling softly behind him. The walk back to the car seemed longer, the weight of Mr. Patel's words hanging heavy on James's shoulders. As he approached the sedan, he saw Michael sit up straighter, suddenly alert. What is it? James asked as he slid back into the driver's seat, passing Michael his coffee and sandwich. Michael nodded towards the warehouse. We've got movement. A van just pulled up to the loading dock. James felt his heart rate pick up. This could be it, the break they'd been waiting for. He pulled out his binoculars, focusing on the van. It was a nondescript white panel van, the kind used by countless businesses across the city. But as he watched, he saw two men emerge from the back, and between them. They've got someone, he said, his voice tight. Looks like a young woman. She's not moving under her own power. Michael was already on the radio, calling for backup. This is it, James, he said. We move now. But as James reached for the door handle, something caught his eye. A flash of white against the grimy snow. He blinked, sure he must be seeing things. But no, there it was again. A dog, thin and bedraggled, limping across the street towards their car. Harris, he said, his voice low. You see that dog? Michael glanced up from the radio, frowning. What dog? James, we don't have time for dash, but James was already opening the door. The dog had stopped under a streetlight, its pale blue eyes locked on James. And in that moment, as the wind howled and the snow began to fall in earnest, James Carter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Because in those eyes, he saw something he recognized all too well. Fear. Pain. And a desperate plea for help. Come on, he said to Michael, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his veins. There's something we need to check out. As they stepped out into the gathering storm, neither man could have guessed how this simple act, following a stray dog on a hunch, would change not just the course of their investigation, but their lives. The game was about to change, and the true depths of the evil they were fighting were about to be revealed. The bitter wind cut through James's coat as he stepped out of the car, his eyes fixed on the emaciated dog standing under the orange glow of the street lamp. Behind him, he could hear Michael muttering about wild goose chases and wasted time, but something in the animal's pale blue eyes held James transfixed. It's just a dog, Carter, Michael said, his voice gruff with frustration. We've got bigger fish to fry. That van dash I know, James cut him off, not taking his eyes off the dog. But there's something. I can't explain it, Harris. We need to follow it. Michael sighed, the sound heavy with years of experience and the weight of their current mission. But he knew his partner well enough to recognize when James's instincts were kicking in. In their line of work, sometimes those gut feelings were all that stood between success and failure, life and death. Fine, Michael relented, checking his weapon. But make it quick. And if this turns out to be nothing, you're buying the drinks for the next month. James nodded, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth despite the tension of the moment. Deal. As if sensing their decision, the dog barked once, a sharp, desperate sound that seemed to echo in the empty street. Then it turned, limping quickly around the corner of the warehouse. The two agents followed, their footsteps crunching in the freshly fallen snow. The dog led them away from the warehouse they'd been watching, deeper into a maze of abandoned buildings and forgotten alleys. The further they went, the more uneasy James felt. This area of Chicago had been hit hard by the economic downturn, leaving behind a wasteland of shuttered factories and boarded-up homes. It was the perfect hunting ground for those who preyed on the desperate and forgotten. After a few minutes of walking, the dog stopped in front of a decrepit building. Its windows were shattered, the walls covered in layers of graffiti telling stories of gang territories and lost hope. The dog whined softly, its tail wagging weakly as it looked back at James and Michael. "This is it," James said, drawing his weapon. "Whatever it is, it's in there." Michael nodded, his own gun already in hand. "I'll take point. You cover me." They approached the entrance cautiously, years of training kicking in as they scanned for any signs of danger. The dog slipped inside through a gap in the boarded-up doorway, disappearing into the darkness beyond. As they entered, the musty smell of abandonment and decay hit them like a wall. James flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a scene of urban desolation. Broken furniture littered the floor, and the walls were scarred with the marks of squatters and addicts who had sought shelter here over the years. "FBI!" Michael called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Anyone here?" Silence was the only response, broken only by the soft whine of the dog somewhere deeper in the building. James and Michael exchanged a glance, then moved forward, their senses on high alert. They made their way through what must have once been a reception area, then down a long hallway lined with offices. Each room they checked was empty, showing signs of hasty abandonment, papers scattered across desks, overturned chairs, the occasional personal item left behind in the rush to leave. As they neared the back of the building, James caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He turned, his flashlight beam landing on the dog. It was sitting in front of a heavy metal door, its tail thumping against the dusty floor. "In here," James said, gesturing to Michael. Michael nodded, positioning himself on one side of the door while James took the other. With a silent count of 3, Michael turned the handle and pushed the door open, both agents sweeping into the room with their weapons raised. What they saw made them both freeze in their tracks. The room was large, probably once a conference room or small warehouse space. But it wasn't the room itself that caught their attention. It was the man tied to a chair in the center of it. He was in bad shape. Blood matted his hair on one side where he'd clearly taken a blow to the head. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut from the beating he'd endured. His clothes were torn and dirty, and even from across the room, James could see he was shivering from the cold. "Jesus," Michael breathed, lowering his weapon slightly as he took in the scene. James was already moving, crossing the room to the man's side. As he got closer, he could see the man's lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin pale from what was likely a combination of blood loss and dehydration. "Sir, can you hear me?" James asked, kneeling beside the chair. The man's head lolled to the side, a groan escaping his lips. He was conscious, but barely. Michael joined them, his eyes scanning the room for any other threats as James began working on the ropes binding the man to the chair. The knots were tight, professional, whoever had done this knew what they were doing. "We need to get him out of here," James said, finally managing to loosen the bonds. "He needs medical attention." Michael nodded, already reaching for his radio to call for backup and an ambulance. But before he could key the MIC, a low growl from the dog made them both freeze. James looked up, his eyes widening as he saw what had alerted the animal. 2 shadows had detached themselves from the darkness near the door, resolving into the forms of 2 men. Both were armed, their weapons trained on the agents. "FBI, drop your weapons," Michael shouted, bringing his gun up in one fluid motion. Instead of complying, one of the men shouted something in a language James didn't recognize. But the intent was clear enough, they weren't here to surrender. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Michael fired first, the crack of his gun deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. One of the attackers went down, clutching his shoulder. But the other managed to get off a shot of his own, the bullet whizzing past James's ear close enough that he felt the displacement of air. James dragged the injured man behind an overturned metal desk, using it as cover as he returned fire. The dog, showing a surprising burst of energy, launched itself at the remaining attacker, its teeth sinking into the man's arm and throwing off his aim. The fight was brief but intense. When it was over, both attackers were down, one nursing a gunshot wound to the shoulder, the other trying to staunch the bleeding from where the dog had savaged his arm. "Clear," Michael called out, his voice tight with adrenaline. James emerged from behind the desk, his heart pounding. "You okay?" he asked his partner. Michael nodded, already moving to secure the two men. "Yeah. You?" "Fine," James replied, turning his attention back to the man in the chair. He was more alert now, his eyes darting between the agents and their downed attackers. "Sir, we're FBI," James said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Can you tell us your name?" The man licked his cracked lips, wincing at the pain. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "David. David Reeves." James felt a jolt of recognition at the name. David Reeves was a journalist who had gone missing 3 weeks ago while working on a story about corruption in the Chicago PD. The disappearance had made headlines, but the trail had quickly gone cold. "Mr. Reeves, we're going to get you out of here," James assured him. "Can you tell us who did this to you?" David's eyes widened with fear, and he shook his head frantically. Not safe," he managed to croak out. "They're everywhere. Cops, politicians, you can't trust anyone." James and Michael exchanged a grim look. If what Reeves was saying was true, their investigation had just blown wide open. This wasn't just about a human trafficking ring anymore. This was something much bigger, something that reached into the very institutions meant to protect the city. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the moment. Backup was on its way. As James helped David to his feet, supporting most of the man's weight, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stumbled onto something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The dog, its job apparently done, sat calmly by the door, its pale blue eyes watching the scene with an almost human intelligence. James found himself wondering, not for the first time that night, what twist of fate had led this animal to them. And more importantly, what other secrets it might lead them to uncover. As they made their way out of the building, David leaning heavily on James while Michael brought up the rear with their two prisoners, the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. They had saved a man's life tonight, yes. But in doing so, they had also opened a Pandora's box of corruption and conspiracy that threatened to engulf the entire city. The cold Chicago night seemed to press in around them as they emerged onto the street, the flashing lights of approaching police cars casting eerie shadows on the snow-covered ground. James looked down at the dog padding silently beside him, its white fur now stained with the blood of the man it had attacked. "What have we gotten ourselves into, boy?" he murmured. The dog looked up at him, those uncanny blue eyes seeming to hold all the answers. But like the city around them, it kept its secrets close, leaving James to wonder what tomorrow would bring, and how deep this rabbit hole would go. As the first police car pulled up, its occupants emerging with hands on their weapons, James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. David's words echoed in his mind, "You can't trust anyone." In a city where the line between protector and predator had become blurred, who could they turn to? And more importantly, how could they protect those who couldn't protect themselves? These were questions that would haunt James in the days to come. But for now, as he helped David into the waiting ambulance, he knew one thing for certain: their real work was just beginning. And somewhere in the shadows of Chicago, a network of evil was about to face a reckoning it never saw coming. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity for James and Michael. After ensuring David Reeves was safely transported to Northwestern Memorial Hospital under guard, they found themselves buried in paperwork and debriefings. The Chicago field office was buzzing with activity, the rescue of a high-profile missing person and the hints of a larger conspiracy sending ripples through the bureau. James sat at his desk, rubbing his tired eyes as he pored over the preliminary reports. The two men they'd apprehended at the abandoned building were proving to be a gold mine of information. One had cracked under interrogation, revealing ties to a sophisticated human trafficking ring with tentacles reaching far beyond Chicago. "Carter," a voice called from across the bullpen. James looked up to see Michael approaching, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you could use this," he said, setting one of the cups on James's desk. "Thanks," James replied, gratefully wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Any word on Reeves?" Michael nodded, pulling up a chair. "Doc says he'll make a full recovery, physically at least. Mentally." He trailed off, shaking his head. "He's pretty shaken up. Keeps talking about a big story he was working on, something about corruption in the department. Says that's why they grabbed him." James frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You think it's connected to our trafficking case?" "At this point, I'd be surprised if it wasn't," Michael replied. "The question is, how deep does this thing go?" Before James could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Special Agent in Charge, Linda Hawkins. A veteran agent with over 2 decades of experience, Hawkins was known for her no-nonsense approach and razor-sharp instincts. "Carter, Harris," she said, her tone brisk. "My office, now." The 2 agents exchanged a glance before following Hawkins to her office. As they entered, James noticed a man he didn't recognize sitting in one of the chairs. The stranger was in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of tan you don't get in a Chicago winter. "Agents," Hawkins began as they took their seats, "this is Thomas Grayson from the Department of Justice. He's here about your case." Grayson nodded at them, his expression unreadable. "Gentlemen, I've been briefed on the situation with Mr. Reeves and your ongoing investigation into the trafficking ring. I'm here because what you've uncovered has implications that go far beyond Chicago." James felt a knot forming in his stomach. He'd suspected their case was big, but involvement from the DOJ suggested it was even larger than he'd imagined. "How far are we talking?" Michael asked, voicing the question James was thinking. Grayson leaned forward, his voice low. "We believe the ring you've been investigating is part of a larger network. International. And there's evidence suggesting high-level involvement from government officials, not just here in Chicago, but potentially in Washington as well." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of this revelation. James found himself thinking of the dog that had led them to Reeves, wondering not for the first time if there had been more to that animal than met the eye. "So what's our next move?" James asked, breaking the silence. Hawkins and Grayson exchanged a look. "We're setting up a joint task force," Hawkins explained. "You two will be working closely with Agent Grayson and his team. We need to move carefully on this one. If what we suspect is true, we're dealing with people who have the power and resources to make problems disappear." As if to underscore her point, at that very moment, a commotion erupted in the bullpen outside. James turned to see agents rushing towards the elevators, hands on their weapons. "What the hell?" Michael muttered, already on his feet. Hawkins was reaching for her phone when an agent burst into the office, his face pale. We've got a situation. Armed suspects in the lobby. They're demanding to speak with the agents who rescued Reeves." James felt a chill run down his spine. He met Michael's eyes, seeing his own shock and determination mirrored there. "Looks like they're not waiting for us to make the next move," James said grimly. Hawkins was already issuing orders, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Carter, Harris, you're with me. Grayson, stay here and coordinate with your team. We need to contain this situation before it gets out of hand." As they made their way to the lobby, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than a simple hostage situation. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, forming a picture that was as terrifying as it was vast. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt interminable. James checked his weapon for the 3rd time, a habit born of years of training and too many close calls. Beside him, Michael was a picture of calm focus, but James could see the tension in the set of his partner's jaw. "Whatever happens," Michael said quietly, "we're in this together." James nodded, grateful not for the first time for his partner's steady presence. As the elevator doors slid open, they stepped out into a scene of controlled chaos. The lobby, usually a bustling space filled with agents and civilians going about their business, had been transformed into a standoff. A group of 5 men, all armed with automatic weapons, had taken up positions behind overturned furniture. Cowering behind the reception desk were several civilians, their faces etched with fear. FBI. Drop your weapons. Hawkins called out, her voice ringing with authority. Instead of complying, one of the men stepped forward. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped hair and eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. When he spoke, his accent was thick, Eastern European. "We want the agents who took David Reeves," he demanded. "Give them to us, and no one else needs to get hurt." James felt a cold anger settling in his gut. These men, whoever they were, had brought their fight right to the FBI's doorstep. It was a bold move, one that spoke of either desperation or a dangerous level of confidence. "That's not going to happen," Hawkins replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Let the civilians go, and we can talk about this." The man's response was a harsh laugh. "Talk? There's nothing to talk about. You've interfered in matters you don't understand. Now you'll pay the price." It happened in the blink of an eye. The man raised his weapon, aiming not at the agents, but at the group of civilians huddled behind the desk. James didn't think, he just acted. He launched himself forward, tackling the nearest hostage to the ground just as the air erupted with the sound of gunfire. Chaos engulfed the lobby. James could hear Michael returning fire, the sharp cracks of his service weapon punctuating the deeper booms of the automatic weapons. Glass shattered, and somewhere, someone was screaming. Rolling to his feet, James dragged the civilian he'd tackled behind a pillar. It was a young woman, probably an intern judging by her age. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Stay down," James instructed her, before peeking around the pillar to assess the situation. 2 of the attackers were down, but the remaining 3 had taken cover behind the security desk. Hawkins was coordinating with a SWAT team that had just arrived, their black-clad figures moving into position with practiced efficiency. James caught Michael's eye across the lobby. His partner nodded, a silent communication born of years working together. They had to end this, and fast, before anyone else got hurt. Taking a deep breath, James made his move. He sprinted across the open space, drawing the attackers' fire. As they focused on him, Michael emerged from his cover, his shots precise and deadly. 2 more of the attackers fell, leaving only their leader. The man seemed to realize his position was untenable. With a snarl of frustration, he turned his weapon on himself. But before he could pull the trigger, a blur of white fur streaked across the lobby. The dog, the same dog that had led them to Reeves, leapt at the man, its jaws clamping down on his arm. The distraction was all James needed. He closed the distance, disarming the man with a swift strike and taking him to the ground. As he secured the handcuffs, James looked up to see the dog sitting calmly nearby, its pale blue eyes watching him with that same uncanny intelligence. "Good boy," James murmured, still trying to process what had just happened. The aftermath of the attack was a flurry of activity. Paramedics tended to the wounded, while agents secured the scene and began the painstaking process of gathering evidence. James found himself giving statement after statement, recounting the events that had led to this moment. Hours later, as the adrenaline began to wear off, James sat in a quiet corner of the office, the faithful dog at his feet. Michael approached, 2 fresh cups of coffee in hand. "Hell of a day," Michael said, handing James one of the cups. James nodded, absently scratching behind the dog's ears. "You can say that again. Any idea who these guys were?" Michael shook his head. "Not yet. But Grayson seems to think they're connected to some big players. Says this attack proves we're on the right track." "Great," James said with a wry smile. "So we've pissed off all the right people." "Looks that way," Michael agreed. He paused, looking down at the dog. "You know, I think this little guy might have saved our bacon today." "Again?" James nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, he did. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How he always seems to be in the right place at the right time." Before Michael could respond, Hawkins approached, her face grave. "Carter, Harris, we need to talk. Grayson's team has been going through Reeves' notes. What they've found, it's bigger than we thought. Much bigger." As they followed Hawkins back to her office, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. The attack on the FBI building wasn't an end, he realized. It was just the beginning. The dog trotted along beside them, its presence a silent reminder of the strange turns this case had taken. Whatever lay ahead, James had a feeling they were going to need all the help they could get, even if it came in unexpected forms. As they entered Hawkins' office, the weight of what they were about to learn settled over James like a heavy cloak. He exchanged a glance with Michael, seeing his own mix of anticipation and apprehension mirrored in his partner's eyes. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And somehow, James knew, that mysterious white dog would be right there with them, leading them deeper into the heart of a conspiracy that threatened to shake the very foundations of the city they had sworn to protect. The bitter Chicago wind whipped snow against the windows of the conference room, mirroring the storm of information swirling inside. James Carter leaned back in his chair, his eyes burning from hours of poring over documents, surveillance photos, and financial records. Across the table, Michael Harris was on his third cup of coffee, the lines on his face deeper than usual in the harsh fluorescent light. "All right, let's go over this one more time," said Linda Hawkins, their SAC, her voice tinged with fatigue but no less sharp for it. "What do we know?" James straightened, shuffling through the papers in front of him. "Based on Reeves' notes and what we've uncovered so far, we're looking at a trafficking operation that spans at least 3 continents. They're not just moving people, they're into drugs, weapons, you name it." Michael nodded, picking up the thread. "The money trail is complicated, but we've identified several shell companies that seem to be funneling profits through offshore accounts. Some of these companies have ties to legitimate businesses here in Chicago, including a couple of high-end restaurants and a construction firm." Thomas Grayson, the DOJ representative, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And the political connections?" James and Michael exchanged a glance. This was the part that had kept them up at night, the implications almost too big to comprehend. "We've got evidence suggesting payoffs to at least 2 city council members, a judge, and..." James paused, the weight of his next words hanging heavy in the air, possibly the deputy mayor. A heavy silence fell over the room. The involvement of such high-ranking officials turned an already complex case into a potential powder keg. Hawkins was the first to break the silence. "All right, we need to move on this, but carefully. We can't risk tipping our hand too soon." "Grayson, what kind of support can we expect from the DOJ?" As Grayson began outlining potential resources, James found his attention drawn to the window. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the city in white. Somewhere out there, he knew, were the people responsible for the suffering of countless victims. The thought made his jaw clench. A soft whine brought him back to the present. The dog, which they had started calling Ghost due to its white fur and uncanny ability to appear and disappear at will, was sitting by his feet, those pale blue eyes fixed on him with an almost human intensity. James reached down to scratch behind Ghost's ears, a gesture that had become almost reflexive over the past few days. The dog's presence was a constant reminder of how this case had started, and how much was still shrouded in mystery. "Carter, you with us?" Hawkins' voice cut through his thoughts. James straightened, refocusing on the meeting. "Yes, sorry." Hawkins nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I know we're all running on fumes here, but we need to stay sharp. Now, about this lead on the warehouse by the river." The meeting continued for another hour, plans being made and discarded as they tried to find the best way to proceed. By the time they broke, the snow outside had turned into a full-blown blizzard. "They're saying it might be the storm of the century," Michael commented as they made their way back to their desks. "Might slow things down a bit." James nodded, his mind already racing ahead to their next moves. "Maybe, but it might also give us the cover we need for surveillance on that warehouse. If this weather keeps up, the streets will be deserted." Michael grinned, a glimmer of their old camaraderie breaking through the tension of the past few days. "You always did like the tough assignments, Carter." "All right, I'm game if you are." As they gathered their gear, James couldn't shake a feeling of anticipation. Something was going to break soon, he could feel it. Whether it would be in their favor remained to be seen. The drive to the warehouse district was slow going, the streets nearly impassable with snow. James gripped the wheel tightly, peering through the windshield at the whiteout conditions ahead. Beside him, Michael was on the phone, coordinating with the backup team that would be stationed a few blocks away. Ghost sat in the back seat, his ears perked forward as if he too could sense the importance of their mission. James had initially been hesitant about bringing the dog along, but something told him they might need Ghost's inexplicable talents before the night was through. As they neared their destination, Michael ended his call. "Backup's in place. They'll move in on our signal." James nodded, pulling the car to a stop in an alley with a view of the warehouse. The building loomed before them, a dark shape against the swirling snow. No lights were visible, but that didn't mean it was empty. "All right," James said, his voice low. "We go in quiet, see what we can find. At the first sign of trouble, we call for backup." "Agreed." Michael nodded, checking his weapon one last time. "Agreed. Let's do this." They stepped out into the storm, the wind immediately biting through their heavy coats. Ghost leapt out after them, his white fur blending seamlessly with the snow-covered landscape. Moving carefully to avoid slipping on the icy ground, James and Michael approached the warehouse. The lock on the side door was new, standing out against the rusted metal. Michael made quick work of it with a set of picks, and soon they were inside, shaking snow from their shoulders. The interior of the warehouse was cavernous, filled with rows of shipping containers and stacks of crates. James swept his flashlight across the space, looking for any signs of recent activity. Beside him, Michael was doing the same, their movements synchronized after years of working together. Ghost padded ahead of them, his nose to the ground. Suddenly, the dog's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. James and Michael froze, hands moving to their weapons. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind outside. Then, from somewhere deeper in the warehouse, came the unmistakable sound of voices. Exchanging a silent look, the two agents moved forward, using the crates for cover. As they drew closer, the voices became clearer. Two men, speaking in rapid-fire Russian. James wished, not for the first time, that he had paid more attention in his language classes at Quantico. But even without understanding the words, the tone was clear. These men were agitated, arguing about something. They rounded a corner and suddenly the speakers came into view. Two men stood by an open shipping container, gesticulating wildly. But it was what James saw inside the container that made his blood run cold. People. At least a dozen, huddled together in the cramped space. Men, women, even a couple of children. Their eyes were wide with fear, their bodies thin and shaking from more than just the cold. James felt a surge of anger so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. This was what they had been fighting against, the human cost of the trafficking ring they'd been investigating. These weren't just numbers on a report anymore, these were real people, their lives destroyed by greed and cruelty. He was about to signal Michael to call for backup when Ghost suddenly darted forward, barking loudly. The two men spun around, reaching for weapons hidden beneath their coats. What happened next was a blur of action. James and Michael burst from their hiding place, identifying themselves as FBI. The suspects opened fire, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. James dove for cover behind a crate, returning fire as he moved. He saw Michael take down one of the men with a well-placed shot, but the other was proving more elusive. The suspect ducked behind the shipping container, using it for cover as he continued to fire. James was about to make a move when he heard a yelp of pain. Ghost had been hit, a streak of red staining his white fur. The sight filled James with a rage he had rarely experienced. Without thinking, he charged forward, firing as he went. His shots found their mark. The second suspect went down, his weapon clattering to the ground. In the sudden silence that followed, James could hear the frightened whimpers of the people in the container. "Michael, you okay?" he called out, not taking his eyes off the downed suspects. "Yeah," came the reply, Michael's voice tight with tension. "I'm good. Calling it in now." As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, James turned his attention to Ghost. The dog was lying on his side, breathing heavily, but his tail thumped weakly against the ground as James approached. "You did good, boy," James murmured, carefully examining the wound. It was a graze, painful but not life-threatening. "Let's get you some help." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Backup arrived, securing the scene and providing medical attention to the trafficking victims. James gave his statement, his voice hoarse from shouting over the howling wind as he explained what had happened. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. James stood outside the warehouse, watching as the last of the ambulances pulled away. Michael joined him, 2 cups of steaming coffee in hand. "Hell of a night," Michael said, handing James one of the cups. James nodded, taking a grateful sip of the hot liquid. "Yeah. But we did it. We got them out." Michael was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "It's a start," he said finally. "But you know this isn't over. There are still people out there, pulling the strings." "I know," James replied, his jaw set with determination. "But we've got names now, leads to follow. We're going to bring this whole operation down, Michael. No matter what it takes." As if in agreement, Ghost limped over to them, his injury bandaged but his spirit undiminished. James knelt down, rubbing the dog's ears affectionately. "And we've got our secret weapon," he said with a small smile. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day when our best asset was a stray dog." As they stood there, the rising sun painting the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had won a significant battle, but the war was far from over. The corruption they were fighting against ran deep, its tendrils reaching into the highest levels of power. But looking at his partner, at the loyal dog at his feet, and thinking of the lives they had saved that night, James knew they were on the right path. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And somewhere out there, in the shadows of the city, those responsible for this evil were about to learn that their days were numbered. The game had changed, and James Carter was ready for whatever came next. With Ghost at his side and Michael watching his back, he felt ready to take on the world. As they walked back to their car, ready to face another day in their relentless pursuit of justice, James couldn't help but feel that they were on the verge of something big. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, very soon, they would have the answers they sought. But for now, there was paperwork to file, leads to follow, and a grateful city to protect. The work of an FBI agent was never done, especially not when there were still shadows to chase and lives to save. With a final pat on Ghost's head, James slid into the driver's seat, ready to continue the fight. The storm had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. The days following the warehouse raid blurred together in a whirlwind of activity. James Carter found himself spending more time at the office than at home, fueled by a mix of coffee, determination, and the nagging feeling that they were on the verge of cracking something big. The evidence they had gathered from the raid, combined with David Reeves' notes and their ongoing investigation, was starting to paint a picture of a network far more extensive and deeply rooted than they had initially imagined. On a particularly grueling Tuesday afternoon, James sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of files and printouts. Ghost, now a fixture in the office despite some initial grumbling from higher-ups, lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to watch the bustle of agents moving about the bullpen. Michael approached, 2 fresh cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you could use this," he said, setting one down on James's desk. "Any breakthroughs?" James rubbed his eyes, grateful for the caffeine boost. "Maybe. Take a look at this." He pushed a file across the desk. "Remember that construction company we flagged earlier? Turns out they've been awarded some pretty lucrative contracts for city projects over the past few years. Way more than you'd expect for a company their size." Michael flipped through the file, his brow furrowing. "Let me guess, these contracts coincide with large deposits in our suspect offshore accounts." James nodded. "Bingo. But here's where it gets interesting. The company's CEO, one Robert Vaughn, has some interesting connections. He's on the board of a charity with our friend the deputy mayor." Well, Michael mused, a grim smile on his face. "Looks like we might have found our link to City Hall." Before James could respond, Linda Hawkins approached their desks, her face set in its usual no-nonsense expression. "Carter, Harris, my office. Now." Exchanging a glance, the 2 agents followed their boss, Ghost trotting along behind them. As they entered Hawkins' office, James was surprised to see Thomas Grayson from the DOJ already there, along with a woman he didn't recognize. "Agents," Hawkins began once they were seated, "this is Special Agent Samantha Reeves from the New York office. She's been working on a case that we believe is connected to ours." The woman nodded at them, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. Pleasure. I've heard good things about your work here in Chicago. James felt a surge of curiosity. New York. How does that tie in with what we're dealing with here? Samantha leaned forward, her voice low and intense. We've been tracking a Russian organized crime syndicate that's been expanding its operations along the East Coast. Human trafficking, drugs, money laundering, the works. But recently, we've started seeing connections to the Midwest, specifically Chicago. Michael nodded slowly. The guys at the warehouse. They were speaking Russian. Exactly, Samantha confirmed. We believe your local operation is just one part of a much larger network. And based on what you've uncovered about political connections here, we think this might go beyond just organized crime. We could be looking at a level of corruption that spans multiple cities, maybe even reaching into federal agencies. The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. James felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was big, potentially career-defining big. But it was also dangerous. If what Samantha was saying was true, they were up against people with serious power and resources. Grayson cleared his throat. In light of this new information, we're expanding the task force. Agent Reeves will be joining your team here in Chicago. We need to pool our resources if we're going to bring this network down. Hawkins nodded, her expression grave. I don't need to tell you how sensitive this is. From this point on, we operate on a need-to-know basis. Trust no one outside this room. As they left the meeting, James's mind was racing. He turned to Michael, keeping his voice low. We need to take another look at everything we've gathered so far. There might be connections we missed. Michael agreed, and they spent the next several hours poring over their files with fresh eyes. Samantha joined them, bringing her own insights and leads from the New York investigation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the office, James sat back, stretching his stiff muscles. They had made progress, identifying several more businesses that seemed to be fronts for the trafficking operation. But something was still nagging at him, a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. I need some air, he announced, standing up. Anyone want to join me for a coffee run? Michael waved him off, engrossed in a financial report, but Samantha stood up. I could use a break too, she said. They made their way out of the building, Ghost padding along beside them. The evening air was crisp, a welcome change from the stuffy office. As they walked, James found himself studying Samantha out of the corner of his eye. There was something about her that intrigued him, an intensity, a drive that matched his own. So, he began, trying to sound casual, how'd you end up on this case? Samantha was quiet for a moment, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. It's personal, she said finally. My sister, she disappeared 3 years ago. We later found out she'd been taken by traffickers. I joined the bureau to find her, to stop others from going through what my family did. James felt a pang of sympathy. I'm sorry. Did you ever? Samantha shook her head, her jaw tightening. No. But every victim we save, every trafficker we put away, it feels like I'm one step closer to justice. For her, and for all the others. They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As they neared the coffee shop, Ghost suddenly tensed, a low growl rumbling in his throat. James immediately went on alert, his hand moving to his concealed weapon. What is it, boy? He scanned the street, looking for any sign of danger. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual evening crowd, people hurrying home from work or heading out for dinner. Then he saw it. A black SUV, parked across the street, its windows tinted. As he watched, the passenger side window rolled down slightly, just enough for him to catch a glint of metal inside. Down! James yelled, tackling Samantha to the ground just as a shot rang out. The bullet whizzed over their heads, shattering the coffee shop window behind them. Chaos erupted on the street. People screamed, running for cover. James pulled his weapon, returning fire as he shouted for Samantha to call for backup. Ghost, showing no fear, charged towards the SUV, barking furiously. The distraction was enough for James to get off a clean shot, hitting the tire of the vehicle. The SUV peeled away, leaving a trail of sparks as it fled on its ruined wheel. Within minutes, the street was filled with police cars and FBI agents. As James gave his statement, he couldn't shake the feeling that this attack was different. It wasn't just an attempt to stop their investigation, it felt personal, like a message. Back at the office, the mood was tense. Hawkins was furious, demanding increased security for all members of the task force. Grayson was on the phone with his superiors in Washington, his voice raised as he argued for more resources. James sat at his desk, Ghost's head resting on his knee. The adrenaline from the attack was wearing off, leaving him feeling drained but more determined than ever. Michael approached, concern etched on his face. "You okay, partner?" James nodded, absently scratching behind Ghost's ears. "Yeah, I'm good. But this changes things, doesn't it?" "They're getting desperate." "Or confident," Michael countered. "Either way, we must be getting close to something big." Samantha joined them, her face pale but resolute. "I've been thinking. The attack, the timing of it. I don't think it was random. I think they knew we were onto something." James felt a chill run down his spine. "You think we have a leak?" Samantha nodded grimly. "It's possible. Which means we need to be even more careful about who we trust." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. If there was a leak, it could be anyone, a fellow agent, someone in the police department, maybe even someone higher up the chain. As the night wore on and plans were made to tighten security and compartmentalize information, James found himself standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there were the people responsible for so much suffering, the traffickers, the corrupt officials, the ones pulling the strings. He made a silent vow, not just to the victims they had saved, but to those still out there, waiting for rescue. He would see this through, no matter the cost. The network might be vast, its tendrils reaching into the highest levels of power, but it wasn't invincible. And with every piece of evidence they uncovered, every connection they made, they were getting closer to bringing it all crashing down. Ghost whined softly, pressing against James's leg as if sensing his determination. James looked down at the dog, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We're close, boy," he murmured. "We're going to finish this." As he turned back to join the others, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The game had changed, the stakes higher than ever. But with his team, Michael, Samantha, and yes, even Ghost, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The network was vast, but it wasn't invisible. And as they dove back into their investigation, piecing together the complex web of corruption and crime, James knew that they were on the verge of something big. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of power and greed. And they were going to drag it into the light, no matter what it took. The weeks that followed the attack on James and Samantha were a blur of activity, sleepless nights, and breakthroughs punctuated by setbacks. The Joint Task Force had transformed a large conference room into their war room, its walls covered with photos, maps, and timelines that told the story of their investigation. At the center of it all was a complex diagram showing the connections they'd uncovered, a web of corruption that stretched from the streets of Chicago to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. James stood before this diagram now, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand, his eyes tracing the lines between names and organizations. Ghost lay at his feet, the dog's presence a constant comfort in the chaos of the investigation. "Penny for your thoughts." Michael's voice broke through James's concentration. James turned to his partner, a wry smile on his face. "Just trying to make sense of it all. Every time I think we've got a handle on how big this thing is, it gets bigger." Michael nodded, his eyes scanning the diagram. "I know what you mean. But we're making progress. That raid on the warehouse in Milwaukee last week? That was a big win." James had to agree. The Milwaukee raid had yielded not just more victims rescued, but a treasure trove of financial records that were helping them trace the money flow through the network. Samantha joined them, a stack of files in her arms. Over the past weeks, she had become an integral part of their team, her insights and determination proving invaluable. "Got something you both need to see," she said, her voice low but intense. She spread out several documents on the table. "Remember that charity we flagged, the one with connections to the deputy mayor? I did some digging into their financials. Look at this." James and Michael leaned in, studying the papers. At first glance, everything looked above board, donations in, grants out. But as Samantha pointed out discrepancies and hidden transfers, a pattern began to emerge. "They're using the charity to launder money," James said, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "And if these numbers are right, we're talking millions." Michael let out a low whistle. "This is it. This is the link we've been looking for between the trafficking operation and the political side of things." The excitement in the room was palpable. After months of work, they finally had concrete evidence tying the criminal enterprise to high-level political figures. But their elation was short-lived. As they were discussing their next steps, Linda Hawkins burst into the room, her face grim. "We've got a problem," she announced. "Judge Harriman just threw out our warrant for the records from Vaughn Construction. Says there wasn't probable cause." The news hit like a bucket of cold water. Judge Harriman was one of the names on their board, someone they suspected of being in the pocket of the trafficking ring. But they hadn't been able to prove it, until now. "He's trying to protect himself," Samantha said, her voice tight with anger. "He must know we're getting close." James felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest. "Then we go over his head. We take this to the Attorney General if we have to. We've got enough here to show this goes beyond just Chicago." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. James, Michael, and Samantha worked around the clock, preparing a comprehensive brief of their evidence. They were taking a risk, potentially exposing their investigation before they had all the pieces in place. But they knew they had to act before more evidence could be suppressed or destroyed. On a rainy Thursday morning, they made their presentation to a joint team from the DOJ and FBI leadership. As James laid out the extent of the network they had uncovered, the trafficking routes, the money laundering operations, the political connections, he could see the shock and dismay on the faces of those assembled. When they finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then, the Attorney General herself spoke up. "This is unprecedented in its scope. You've done outstanding work here, agents. What do you need to bring this home?" The response was swift and decisive. Within hours, they had approval for a series of coordinated raids across multiple states. SWAT teams were mobilized, warrants were issued, and a media blackout was put in place to prevent any leaks. As they geared up for the operation, James found a quiet moment with Ghost. The dog had been with them through every step of this investigation, from that first night when he led them to David Reeves, to countless stakeouts and breakthroughs. James knelt down, scratching behind Ghost's ears. "We did it, boy," he murmured. "We're going to take them down." The raids began at dawn. Across Chicago, New York, and several other cities, teams moved in on offices, warehouses, and private residences. James and Michael led the team hitting Robert Vaughn's mansion, while Samantha coordinated the operation from the command center. As they breached the front door, James felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment they had been working towards for months. Room by room, they cleared the house, securing evidence and taking Vaughn into custody. But it wasn't until they reached the study that James realized the true impact of what they had uncovered. There, in a hidden safe behind a painting, they found documents that laid bare the entire operation. Names, dates, amounts. It was the smoking gun they had been searching for. As the day wore on, reports came in from the other teams. The deputy mayor was in custody. So was Judge Harriman. Several high-ranking police officials had been arrested. And in a twist that sent shockwaves through the political establishment, a senator from Illinois was being brought in for questioning. Back at the office, the mood was one of exhausted elation. They had done it. The network that had seemed so vast and untouchable was crumbling. As James sat at his desk, trying to process the events of the day, he felt a nudge at his leg. Ghost looked up at him, those pale blue eyes seeming to reflect the mix of emotions James was feeling. "You know," Michael said, collapsing into the chair next to James, "when you first started bringing this mutt around, I thought you were crazy. But I've got to admit, he's been one hell of an asset." James smiled, reaching down to ruffle Ghost's fur. "He's been more than that. He's been a partner." Samantha joined them, a rare smile on her face. "Well, boys, we did it. It's going to take months to sort through all the evidence, but we've broken the back of this operation." As they sat there, the weight of their accomplishment settling over them, James thought about all the lives that would be changed by what they had done. The victims who would be rescued, the families who would get justice, the future victims who would be spared because of their work. In the days and weeks that followed, the full scope of their operation became clear. The media dubbed it the Ghost Network, a nod to both the shadowy nature of the criminal enterprise and, though they didn't know it, the faithful canine who had played such a crucial role. James found himself in demand for interviews and debriefings, recounting the investigation to FBI classes and congressional committees alike. But through it all, he never forgot the real heroes, the survivors who had found the courage to speak out, the tireless work of his fellow agents, and yes, the mysterious white dog who had started it all. One crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after that fateful night when Ghost had led them to David Reeves, James stood in a small park near his apartment. Ghost was at his side, grey now around the muzzle but still alert and loyal as ever. As they watched the city come to life around them, James reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The dangers they had faced, the late nights and early mornings, the moments of doubt and the triumphs. A young woman jogged past, then stopped and turned back. "Excuse me," she said, a bit breathless. Is that Ghost? The dog from the news stories?" James nodded, smiling as Ghost's tail began to wag at the attention. The woman's eyes widened. "Wow. You know, what you guys did, it gave a lot of people hope. My cousin, she was one of the ones you saved. So, thank you. Both of you." As she jogged away, James felt a lump form in his throat. This was why they did the job. Not for the accolades or the promotions, but for moments like this. For the lives changed and the hope restored. He looked down at Ghost, who gazed back with those intelligent blue eyes. "What do you say, boy? Ready for another adventure?" Ghost barked once, his tail wagging furiously. And as they set off down the path, James Carter felt a sense of peace and purpose. The world wasn't perfect, and there would always be more battles to fight. But for now, in this moment, he knew that they had made a difference. They had brought light to the darkness, hope to the hopeless. And in doing so, they had become something more than just an FBI agent and a stray dog. They had become a symbol of what was possible when good people refused to give up, when they stood up against injustice no matter the odds. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and promise, James and Ghost walked on. Ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, but secure in the knowledge that together, they could face anything. For they had learned the most important lesson of all, that even in the darkest of times, hope could find a way. And sometimes, that hope came in the most unexpected forms.